Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. First of all, just good morning, everybody. Monica, thank you for your support. Thank you to a couple folks who gave. Dylan Rodriguez signed up for a membership the other day. And let's see if I can find out who. Somebody also gave a super thanks to the conversation we had with Laura Shihai yesterday or Tuesday. So anyways, appreciate the support as always. Make sure to do the basics and like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We're getting close to 6,000 subscribers, and it'd be great to get that possibly by the end of the month. Maybe that's a little bit ambitious, but soon. And support us on Patreon if you do not already. Um, and so today we have a guest that I'm really excited to be in conversation with. Folks who listen on the audio podcast will remember that on October 13th, we published a conversation with our guest today, Frances Hasso, as well as Sina Rahmani from the East is a Podcast. Josh Briand, co-host, was there as well. And that was kind of like a quick initial reaction right after October 7th, as well as the initial days of the kind of genocidal response, right, that we've seen now for 7+ months. Anyway, that's one way people may know Frances. People may also know Frances from the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network, which she organizes with and supports and is a member of. So the book we're here to talk about, first I should say Frances has written extensively on Palestine and has written a number of books, and I hope this to be kind of a first of a few conversations on her work, which I think is really valuable and important and interesting, right? And this one is on her most recent book, which is Red Dirt: Race, Reproduction, and Death in Modern Palestine. Buried in the Red Dirt: Race, Reproduction, and Death in Modern Palestine. It is available open access, so people can get it a digital copy for free. There's a link for that in the show description. So I encourage people to do that, and then also to buy a physical copy, especially if that's the way that you like to read books. So Frances Hasso is a professor in the program of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University. She holds secondary appointments in the Department of Sociology and the Department of History. She is a 2018-19 fellow at the National Humanities Center. She is the editor emerita of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. She joined the Duke faculty in 2010 after 10 years at Oberlin College. Her scholarship focuses on gender and sexuality in the Arab world. Most of her publications are available open access on the publications tab that's of her website, which I'll also make sure to link. It's just franceshasso.net. Put that in the comments now. And as I already mentioned, she's a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network. So, Frances, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism again. It's good to be in conversation with you once again.
Hey, Jared. Thanks for having me.
I should also say you're a veteran of the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism study group, reading group, many times over. So it's good to be with you in this space. So let's see, let's get started. So let's just start by talking a little bit about this book project in kind of, broad terms. Like, what were the things, what brought you to this project? What were you looking to explore, and kind of the key questions or interventions you were interested in examining with this book?
Yeah, so originally I was interested in abortion and reproduction, but from a historical perspective. And I wanted, like, especially with big projects, I worry about getting bored. And So it's both like I wanted to learn some new things and also contribute to existing scholarship. And and I felt like I knew a lot about contemporary Palestine and related gender and sexuality issues, both because I'm a researcher and a scholar, and I read and I teach the material, I review and I edit a lot of scholarship. And I was also, I should note, um, this book came after taking a break from Palestine scholarship because I was so exhausted and demoralized, and felt like the work wasn't doing anything. And yeah, so for a few years, I worked on non Palestine Arab world published. Um, but I did decide for Palestine, okay, I'm not going to deal with the present. And so I have a historical sensibility with all projects, but I've never, said, okay, I'm going to do a historical project. So I met a lot of Palestinian colleagues, experts. Some people were friends, some people became friends. And I soundboarded, like what I was thinking. And they first confirmed for me that abortion is stigmatized. And also I knew it was illegal, during the British mandate. So that meant, how do I find, I also knew from the literature that it was highly discouraged for Jews by Zionist institutions. So I had to figure out, well, how do I study something that was illegal, which means documents, you know, wouldn't really exist. And I learned a lot more about how medical people in the past and the present deal with the stigmatized and the illegal. And one way is by not recording it, as what it is, and so, or what it was. And yeah, and then the other issue is that memoirs and oral histories, they tend to, whether it's with women or not women, and mostly it's with men, survivors of the British period, and I mean like oral histories and memoirs published earlier, and that they were, it's like big picture stuff, not really the intimate, you know. Um, yeah, and if it's stigmatized and illegal, it's even less likely that there would be anything like that. So ultimately, I did do archival work, as you know, and I also did a lot of things I'm very good at, which is conversations and field work and interviews, and that was, in multiple countries. So yeah, and in the process, I learned really first from conversations, and then thinking about my own, like relative background, that there was high rates of infant death, and so, and that was in the archives as well. But it's really through conversations that you learn from people that, oh, like a lot of children died, or, something very common among Arabs, I would say, is the, kind of naming another child the name of the child who died, yeah. So then you just learned from older people that a lot of children died. So that became one of my questions as well, is thinking about, well, why did a lot of children die, during the British mandate? Yes,
Yeah,
kind of the path.
that's great. I think yeah, I mean, just to add some, as you mentioned, you're looking at the British Mandate period, right? So you're looking at the period before the Nakba, before, the what people would consider the creation of the state of Israel, right? And it, of course, interestingly, it was called Palestine, right, during the Mandate period as well. And yeah, I mean, we'll get into all of this, but those examinations, I think, bring you to some really interesting, research just around the kind of really apartheid type structures that were already in place in the colonial mandate period, and the different systems and the way that also Zionism, kind of interacts and influences um, the health system, right, and as well as British colonialism, how it impacts it as well. And so yeah, look forward to getting through into some of those things with you today. So one of the things you talk about in the introduction, which I think is an interesting thing, and I wanted to talk about it, even though it's not like something that your book is, it's not deeply about this, but you do talk about Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, and his embrace of Zionism. And, this is something that does come up periodically. He has this horrible statement that people bring around every once in a while. I think it was in 48 or so, right? Um, and a very pro-Zionist, statement or letter. And it came up, of course, recently. Geomar published this article that was about Du Bois's paradigm of abolition and reconstruction as a lens to think about Palestinian liberation. And a few people brought up in response to that, of course, that maybe this isn't the time to do that because Du Bois himself was actually a Zionist. And so you're looking at this from kind of a historical perspective, talking about it within the context of Du Bois's work on the color line, which of course is very important to the development of Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism in certain ways in this time. And the early work of a kind of international human rights paradigm, which of course, Du Bois was also trying to influence in certain ways, that we, inherit in certain ways from that period through groups like the League of Nations and then the creation of the UN. And so, talk a little bit about some of the things you were looking to draw attention to with regards to this section on Du Bois and that era of internationalism.
Yeah, so this part of the book actually came very late in the process of writing. It was early in the COVID lockdown. And then I wrote it in the last 8 months, before the book went to press. And what happened is that I had the privilege of getting a Franklin Humanities Institute book manuscript workshop the previous fall, and it was scheduled for spring, so 2023. So I finished a draft by February or March for what I think was in April, the workshop. And so there were two external scholars, both historians, one of the British Empire and one of Egypt, whose work I really love. I asked for them, and a handful of colleagues at Duke, who I also asked to participate. And this became, normally these are in person, and this became a Zoom panel, like a very early for me, for all of us, I think. At that point, I actually did not have race in the title. I had Buried in the Red Dirt. I think, I know I didn't have race in the title. I think I had Reproduction and Death. And so, yeah, so basically I found myself getting a little defensive in the about race, because it was like in everything, but maybe there was a little bit of pushback on that, and so that just, I mean, this is why I love these processes, but I thought, okay, well, it's clear race is absolutely central. So I need to dig in. And so what I did, and this also is because of COVID, pretty much everything was shut down. I mean, you couldn't really, like, our libraries were shut down. UNC, like, you had to go somewhere to but you couldn't really, yeah. Anyway, all the normal things were not possible. So, but a lot is digitized, and people are still on the phone, and people are still on email. So I thought, well, let me dig in, to this, and also because I am a sociologist, so I I didn't know Du Bois did anything about Palestine. I just knew, the color line. I've taught his work. I've obviously read his work, and I knew the global color line. But it's really through writing that and digging in is first I was reminded that Du Bois was at very many international conferences, and Pan-Africanist, intellectual. He circulated. He was at Versailles, right? And so a lot of people were at the Versailles conference, but Du Bois was as well. Yeah, so it's like I did two things. I both dug into the Versailles conference and its documents, and I dug into Du Bois. And yeah, and so basically, so the field, I mean, one of my things is that, I'm trained in area studies. That's one area I'm trained in. And political science and historians, they don't necessarily deal with race the way I do. So, and even in treating World War I and in treating the Versailles Conference and the Arab delegation and the Arab delegation documents, which I also got access to a number of them to read. So yeah, but so getting back to Du Bois, so one thing I learned is that he attended the 1911, what's it called, conference. It was a very famous conference in London called the Universal Races Conference. And I think he was very influenced, I can't prove it, by a paper by the British Zionist Israel Zangwill. And I also analyze his paper, the British Zionist Zangwill. And sociology actually, all the founding men of sociology, Du Bois, Marx, and Durkheim, that's how we're trained. And then Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and then later Du Bois, right? But they were internationalists, but US sociology is very nationalistic and US bound in its questions, like a lot of US fields. So anyway, so I just really started thinking more about Du Bois as an internationally relevant scholar. And that just opens up a lot of questions. And of course, he studied in Berlin. He wrote letters to Weber. They wrote back and forth. Yeah. And so he was connected to all these intellectuals. And then, then I track, so he doesn't do much on Palestine during Versailles, but then I, was going through all the primary sources I had access to, like his publications, speeches, things like that. And I found the 1948 essay, which it's all in my book, in the footnotes and everything. So even though he was deeply critical of white supremacy, and even though, and I go through the articulation of the global color line argument, I think he was nevertheless a US positioned, elite scholar. And I think he, and here I think Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly has also made this argument that Du Bois was an idealist, like in Hegelian terms. You see that in, the work. But I also think he was inevitably shaped by anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Ottoman racisms. And those were in the circles that he was part of. So, and there's little punctures in that, even in the early documents. But yet, yeah. So that's what. So yeah, I'm very curious, but not for the book that I published, what happened afterwards. And Robeson was a Zionist too. And you could say with Robeson, that had something to do with his strong communism, the Soviet Union, that, like I haven't traced that genealogy either. But Du Bois, like his ideology wasn't like, it wasn't Robeson's ideology. And I am curious if Du Bois changed his mind, even he lived a really long time, and that you see that the work is also very different, and, it keeps developing. Yeah, I'm very curious where he went with that. Do you know?
Yeah. I don't know, and it's a good question, because, yeah, I mean, 48 is he doesn't quite live to 67, right? So it would be interesting to know, like, how it would have developed if he had lived that long, I think he dies in 63,
Right,
and it would have been interesting to see how, as he gets towards the end of his life and he's very much changed by the Chinese,
right.
revolution, relationship to Mao, and then also to Nkrumah, and and kind of that, you know, he moves to Ghana, of course, at the end of his life. And so yeah, it would be interesting to know if he did develop out of that, because there's a lot of positions that Du Bois takes kind of early on, Souls of Black Folk and some of his other work in that period, that people can look at critically and say, like, this he always did. I will say this, like, he's very much, seems to me that, and I don't want to say always, but throughout a lot of the first 60 years of his life or so, um, he is attached to certain notions, certainly of like progress and education and civilization, right? That, I mean, it also leads him to weird positions like his support for Japan during World War II, right? And so there's definitely some aspects of Du Bois. I agree with what you're saying in terms of he develops a lot, especially in throughout his whole life, but towards the end is when he really gets to, like, a fuller embrace of communism, although he's in those circles, all of his life. And yeah, towards the end, I think he was closer to Robeson. I think there was a lot of influence between his wife, Shirley, and then also Eslanda and Paul. I know that there's books written about that. But yeah, it is an interesting thing. And I guess one of the things I'm thinking about as you're writing it in that section too is there's implications on this international system that you're thinking about, partly through Du Bois and partly through other figures in this time, for Palestinians in particular, but also kind of for Arab people, more broadly speaking, in terms of like kind of their exclusion from this order, right, from the beginning, or from, uh, yeah, I don't know. Do you have, is that part of what you're
Yeah,
getting at
I
there?
mean, yeah, there's that conference is just the documents are really interesting from that conference. I mean, everybody should remember that Jan Smuts, who is an Afrikaner who fought with the British, an Afrikaner from South Africa, who is a complete racist, wrote the, what is it, the mandates document, that was published in 2016. I mean, in 26, no, 1916. And so that was distributed, all over the world. It was like a plan, right? A post World War One, post Great War plan. And he, he is the one that writes, that kind of divides the world into class A, class B, and class C um, mandates. And yeah, so digging into the Versailles Conference is worth it because, and digging into it from different positions, like speaking of Japan, Japan's just very interesting because in the early 20th century, for a lot of Arabs, not only Du Bois, there was like this recognition that technology, that one way to free yourself from colonialism and imperialism is through like technology. It's sort of like the argument about the Palestinian resistance now, like violence, do you support the fact is colonialism and imperialism sets the terms for how, for like subordination and resistance to subordination. So there's some kind of not romanticization, but admiration for like a non-white society fighting, and of course it's an empire. And I write about this in the intro chapter and the relationship with Korea. I had to dig in, but I also found out that learned that there's scholarship on, there was an explicitly anti-racism debate and argument in Versailles. And I had no idea that that was true. And so for the people arguing that, race is an anachronistic category to be imposing on the World War I and after World War I, no, it wasn't anachronistic. They were using, and that 1911 conference was explicitly about race. It was a progressive conference. It had Bois was there, anthropologists were there, sociologists, diplomats from all over the world. And those papers are public if people are interested. And I have a citation in my book. But what was more shocking is that at Versailles, there was a debate about race and that it was defeated. And that even though the United States was not a signer to the League of Nations, that the US was deeply, deeply involved in all the debates and in Versailles and in the mandates deeply. And so from very high up, and they helped defeat, arguably, they were the most important factor in helping defeat an anti-race discrimination dimension of what comes out, from that conference. And so okay, so then you're like, okay, well, why are the Japanese leading an anti-race discrimination argument at Versailles? They're leading it because actually Japanese masses were asking for that. And also they were asking for it in relation to the US, right? To anti-immigration, exclusion, all these kinds of racial laws and systems in the United States. So anybody arguing, that was my thing, like anybody arguing that race was not on the minds of people at that conference, well, it was. And it was, and there were different. Now, I also show that for the Arab delegation, I have no evidence that they were part of those debates. They weren't allowed to be or involved in the parts of that conference where that was the major discussion. But I did go into that part of the conference just to make it's the way I make my arguments, which is to just, kind of build up that that foundation. And I did get into the memoirs, which I got with some help, of some of the Arab delegates at the conference, and they were elites. I mean, they were, from Arabia, from what's today Lebanon. They were mixed religions. They were cosmopolitans, people of multiple languages who also knew Europe well. They knew Istanbul, they knew Jerusalem, and they knew Iraq. And yeah, so I looked into their memoirs to see if they write anything about race. And and I kind of pull out areas where they're talking about what we would call racism, among the Europeans that they were dealing with. So yeah, but back to Jan Smuts, I mean, that whole setup is set up by a white Afrikaner, South African, who was British. I don't know the rank, but he was a high rank and very, very respected. So yeah, and I also show, using other scholarship, that there was something called, the Christian Muslim. There were some like more mass-based, projects in historic Palestine that were trying to get to the Versailles Conference. They were excluded. They were not even allowed to get in. The French and the British kind of worked together to exclude the colonized who lived in the colonized world. But still, it was London. And there were like Ho Chi Minh, I think it's Ho Chi Minh. I write about Ho Chi Minh being there. He just worked as a waiter, in a hotel, and he was a student. But he led there were a lot of delegations that were not allowed to be in there. There was a lot going on. And there hasn't, as far as I know, been a people's history of that. I would love that, with people who have different language knowledges and access to different documents. But there was a Pan-Africanist. I mean, Du Bois was there for a Pan-Africanist delegation that was also there. But you always have to think about scales. I always do. And who's in what room, So people were often in different rooms because they weren't allowed to be, but they were still having really vigorous kinds of debates and arguments. And I think it was Ho Chi Minh that presented against the French what is it? I forgot, like signed by thousands of people asking for the end of French imperialism. So there was, I think it's far more exciting. It was probably far more exciting than we often understand it. But it sets the stage for, the post-World War I colonization of the world, for what happens in the colonization of Palestine, kind of what happens after the end of the Ottoman Empire, which formally doesn't end until 1924. And we should keep that in mind, because it's 2024. It's not that long ago, not at all. In collective memory, yeah.
Yeah. One text that goes into a little bit of that history as well is Adam Garachu's World Making After Empire. She talks in that, about Jan, I don't know if it's Jan, I guess Jan Smuts. I want to say Jan because
I think that might be right, but yeah, Jan. But anyway, I'm gonna call him Smuts, because that's
Smuts.
better.
Yeah, we'll just say Smuts.
That works.
But yeah, about how he and Woodrow Wilson, really because this part of what was being debated around this is like, what is self-determination and who gets to decide this? And,
Mhm.
Smuts's position was that, racialized people are not ready for self-determination, and that one quote from her book is, Wilson and Smuts argued that racially backward people were not suited for democracy, but could partake in minimal forms of consent and were owed some modicum of respect. Right. And she talks in many ways about how their version of self-determination, which comes out of that conference and others, um, and is key in the founding of the League of Nations as well, that it's fully, compatible with imperialism, right, and
Yeah,
colonialism,
yeah. I mean,
and
I
yeah.
would just add to that, I haven't read that book, I don't think, but I would add that I just found a lot of evidence that they knew they were lying about, that there's always this double thing where there's a recognition actually that that the colonized would, the minute they got a chance, would totally compete with them and kick their asses basically, and on all levels. And sometimes you got a sense of this in the documents that, along with, oh, they're like biologically, culturally, or whatever backward, because you definitely had that. You also just had lots of little pieces of evidence. Oh, they're not, and they actually, they might be dangerous, to our hegemony and our political and economic power. So yeah, I never take that stuff at face value. And Smuts, I mean, I think I say this in a footnote, but even till the end, there were some colonizers who were like, oh, the Indians, right, who were kind of moved around as a fighting force and a labor force in various parts of the British Empire. Um, they should have some rights, they should be, have medium rights, or, they're closer to what we would consider to be the epitome of civilization. He fought that. So he fought that. And
it
I don't,
it makes
I
sense.
think go ahead.
It makes sense that he would fight that as an Afrikaner too, because
Exactly.
there was a lot of Indian forced immigrants into South Africa, and it would have been a probably a problem for, white apartheid South Africans to kind of manage, these additional rights for. I think they used colored, right, as the broad term,
Yes, yes,
within, yeah.
yes. Yeah. And I would just say one last thing about that, which is that, uh, I found, I don't remember if it was the secondary sources or primary sources, but California, um, having lived and studied in California, I mean, California was absolutely crucial to the Versailles Conference because they were getting from the white settler, from the political leaders, the economic leaders, do not agree to an anti-race discrimination thing. So yeah. So one thing in this book is I show how Palestine is not just about, we could think of like a global Palestine, that a bunch of, that it's very, very easy, just one or two layers, and all of a sudden you're in all kinds of other parts of the world.
Right on.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you really do, I mean, I don't think you ever say this. So this is me putting my analysis of the book, but you demonstrate sort of basically the development of what I would call an apartheid medical system that's already in place under the British colonial mandate period. So can you talk a little bit about some of the components of this system? Like, who's responsible for what in terms of healthcare, and how was the discourse around health used internationally with regard to Zionism, as well as like Palestinians and the role of the British.
Yeah. So here, so chapter 1 is where I kind of set the frame for that, and that's titled "We Are Far More Advanced: The Politics of Ill and Healthy Babies in Palestine." And what I show is that first, that lack of British investment in healthcare for Palestinians was endemic and systematic. And it was part of a colonial ecology that they segmented by nationality, religion, and what they called race. And, as I said, I found that Palestinians disproportionately died very young of poverty, hunger, and disease during the 30 years of British colonial rule, and that this was overdetermined by colonial austerity in healthcare and also infrastructure provision. They built, like everywhere, they built infrastructure that served them. And also they extracted. And I think sometimes we forget that, like, what's the logic of imperialism and colonialism? And they extracted from the native population. But the maybe, the interesting thing about Palestine is you also had this, you could compare it to a Zionist settler project that that flourished and was allowed to and encouraged to by the British. And what they did is they built health and science institutions and universities, and the funding was coming from really like well-established and pretty wealthy and educated Jewish communities in the white settler world, like New Zealand, Australia, London, New York, Philly, and their goal was to improve Zionist and like health, like Jewish health, basically, and in Palestine, and Jewish maternal health, and they definitely had a racial demographic logic that was going on. And as people who, critically study the progressive area and medicine know, that these progressive projects were coming at they were in the same environment as eugenic logics, right? And so they were about having certain women have babies, certain babies surviving. There was a lot of anxiety about how many children different women were having in the United States and in the world. And I think making some kind of division into, I don't know, like really radical divisions between right and left or whatever doesn't really serve our purposes. I like Hadassah was started by Jewish women who were Zionists, who were very active in Brooklyn and Philly around progressive era social work and social medicine. And they took that to Palestine, and then the target there was Jewish babies, Jewish mothers, and especially indigenous, like Yemeni Jewish, basically Arab Jews were the first target. So in terms of who was responsible for what, the British basically subcontracted Palestinian health to foreign Christian missionary institutions, French, British, US, Austrian, Italian, German. And these were disproportionately concentrated in areas where they had interests in conversion. I am starting to work on a new project based on primary sources with the Christian missionary archives. like exactly what health workers, what their main concerns were. But a major one was conversion. And that meant they focused on Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and not necessarily the places where the largest concentrations of Palestinians were. And so these missionary institutions, as I show, they weren't necessarily well funded, by their European and US offices, but they were often free or relatively inexpensive for Palestinians. See, the missionaries wanted Palestinians to come more than, this is like for education and health. Those are two areas that, you go into these imperial colonial settings and you use the widespread need for those health and education. And it is designed to get people on your side, culturally, and especially for conversion. But at least if they can ally with you on the imperial and colonial project. So the quality depended on the time and the institution in terms of the quality of healthcare. And I show how they were often run by nuns. I mean, they were often run by women, all these institutions. So in addition to the missionaries, the British established government hospitals, and they had 3 classes of fees, and most Palestinians were working class or poor and couldn't even pay 3rd-class fees, as I show with the story of the little girl Yasmin and her mother. So that's another thing. Plus, there were infant and welfare centers that mostly were municipality. Palestinians did those. They got the money. They set them up. They brought in the furniture. Sometimes the British complained, it was all clunky furniture, but people basically wanted, they knew that health was important. There was need for that. And the British were responsible as the mandate power. Yeah, one thing, I have this in, other people have written about this. The mandate set up communities along religious terms. They're very happy. They were very happy they're like, well, if you could set up stuff as Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And Jews took them up on that. But even then, there was a very Palestinian nationalist sensibility that refused that logic. So Palestinians were like, well, you're the occupier. You need to give money to these infant welfare centers. And I do a lot based on really interesting documents of the battles in the infant and welfare centers, and how the British took credit for things that, unwarranted credit. So, because they're cheap. They often didn't pay. They paid minimal, but they wanted control. But then there's a whole other segment for Palestinian health, which was Palestinian midwives and Palestinian physicians and nurses. And people went and they paid. And that's in but they paid reasonable prices, and they felt, loved and connected with. In the book, I just show in different parts of Palestine how people, they're like the Armenian doctor so-and-so. We all went to him, we tried everything. And then okay, we left the village and we went to see him. And then there were a lot of traditional, most people got their healing from traditional healers, and they were mostly women and traditional midwives. So because of money, actually. And, but because there's a tradition of natural healing and communal knowledge around that. So then I'm able to compare that with Zionists who have just really invest in that and are allowed to invest in it and are also allowed to control it. I mean, yes, they reported, and yes, there were British rules, but there was a lot more self-governance for the Jewish, there was, yeah, for the Jewish institutions. And so, and a lot more money. So then when you look, you could see dramatic what turns out to be racialized differences in health and infant well-being and infant death. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this interesting, I mean, part of this too then is like how also that information, right? Or those like you develop a set of statistics like based off of these differentials in infant mortality and stuff like that. And like then that becomes also a justification as well for we're the more advanced, right? Like our civilization is superior, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a very interesting discussion about hygiene, and the kind of colonial politics of Western hygiene. And it reminded me in some ways of Saidiya Hartman's work around in Scenes of Subjection. She talks about how after formal emancipation, that one of the things that a lot of these kind of abolitionist groups get into is like teaching hygiene to um formerly enslaved people, right? And it's very kind of it's connected with a kind of civilizing mission, connected with this weirdly with like ideas of would it be like work thrift or being like productive workers, which of course is sort of, I mean, painfully ironic, right? For people who've been worked through violence, violent their work was demanded through violence, right? For decades. But there's this interesting thing, like it is, I know it comes up in other studies around colonialism, and around kind of logics again also of I guess we could say coloniality, right? Of like the West bringing hygiene to these people of the world who don't have it, right? And so just talk a little bit about the politics of hygiene within colonial mandate Palestine, and what kind of you use this term nutritional governmentality too, which I really appreciated. So and I think that we still see also, as we think about Palestine today, this language, right, of uncivilized or savage or whatever, as they're actually like, if we're talking about today, they're being bombed and they're being starved, right? But then there's this way that Zionists then project onto that, like they're not as human as we are, so
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, like, in one of the chapters opens with the Palestinian nurse Alice Butros, fighting with the British around getting care, and she, and the way I learned, I tracked her is because she destroyed the face of a teaching doll. So absolutely destroyed it. And the nurse matron was talking to, I found documents of her trying to get the director of public health to help her fix the face of this doll, right? So their whole thing was, oh, like, we're going to teach you how to be healthy and have healthy babies and be good mothers. And that's why, your babies are getting measles or pneumonia or enterica. So they were obsessed with the pedagogical dimensions of educating the so-called backward masses on everything. And they use that as a way to avoid actual redistribution of resources, building infrastructures for water and sewage, and providing health care. And you can do a little geographic kind of mapping of places and diseases and sort of show the crucialness of British policy, including privatizing certain things like or draining. There's a link between the draining of certain areas to deal with malaria, which they were most afraid of for themselves, and the rise of other diseases. And so, or places where workers were concentrated, like in Haifa, Palestinian workers from villages, and but then they're living in horrible conditions, and so you can do this kind of mapping of diseases and illnesses and the kind of colonial and imperial interests and map. So for Palestinian women and children, the focus was giving women lectures on health and mothering to the detriment of providing food and healthcare. And that included like milk, powdered milk, later milk. There was a lot of external interest. So that's for Palestinian women. And then I found a lot of external interest in breastfeeding that targeted Jewish women and Jewish health institutions. But the Jewish institutions aligned like this education with resources, and they closely tracked pregnant women and their babies, pregnant Jewish women and their babies. And I realized as well, and that I'm sure, other scholars know this, but I came to the realization in this project that the entire literature on mother's milk, breastfeeding hygiene, and baby care, which was massive. And it was not, and it was not just limited to European countries. It has Indian varieties, Indian anti-colonial varieties. So this entire literature was tied to eugenic interests, and definitely in colonized Palestine all over the world. And it emerges from the centers of white imperial power and their satellites. And so some of this literature is in Palestine, it's in the archives. So they were concerned about the reproduction and survival of white babies, and in Palestine, Jewish babies. And they were concerned about it in a global imperialist vision of hegemony over the hordes, quote unquote. I found like really crazy documents in the archives that took me on deep dives into so-called breast hygiene, baby feeding, sleeping, baby sleeping, eugenics. And that led me to Indianapolis, Indiana, Wellington, New Zealand, Boston, Cambridge, Philly, and London. So I had to learn a lot about epidemiology and disease generally to write this book, like why were Palestinian babies more likely than Jewish babies to die from measles, for example. So what I found is that British health officials in Palestine, who had been health officials in other British colonies, and you were more likely to have been in Africa, if you came to Palestine, they knew that undernourished children who, for example, contracted whooping cough or measles had lower resistance to TB. And they also knew that hungry babies have lower resistance to pneumonia and enterica, which is diarrhea. So babies and young children in these situations were most likely to die, and they knew it. They also knew that adult Palestinians were highly malnourished in the 1920s and the 1930s, and they were equally susceptible to disease and early death. And I show in the book that even at a time when the British budget in Palestine was well in the black, which it was only in the red beginning in 1936 with the Arab Revolt, that even then, that Palestinians were starving. They knew that Palestinians were starving in a number of districts. So they had the epidemiological knowledge, and we know that there was structural production of Palestinian hunger, disease, and premature death. But at the same time, they have to use racialized, cultural, imperialist explanations. And what they did is they criticized Palestinian foodways, They blamed women. They always blame women, by the way, everywhere, for not being efficient, not using the right ingredients. There was a real obsession actually with milk at that time, like cow's milk. Which isn't, which in the regions there, in a lot of parts of the world, there's lactose, there's intolerance for milk as milk, right? Not maybe as cheese or, but there's intolerance for milk as milk, but they were obsessed with milk. But yeah, so they also blamed people for polluted waterways, for not having sewage systems, for lack of sanitation services. And I again want to go back to, I don't want to romanticize anything, like including Palestinian municipalities, but they knew a lot of the science and they knew a lot of the research and they worked on those questions. But the British took control of Palestinian municipalities and actually extracted a lot of money from them. And this is one of the reasons why municipalities were like, you have to pay back, into the system. You have to provide. But yeah, so they complained about polluted waterways, about spitting, about lack of hygiene and food preparation, and people eating communally. So I found the discourse was just like never ending. And I show how they borrowed it from racist tropes. They just translated racist tropes that they used in Africa and Asia. But ultimately, it was about imposing austerity policies. And they did have a logic that they said that they used, which each country has to pay for its own colonization. Well, like, how are you going to do that? And they called it making the country pay for itself. Yeah. And again, I just think that we have to remember that colonialism and imperialism are extractive projects designed to consolidate power and maldistribute wealth within and between countries. Why would they provide, like dignified healthcare or education to the colonized? But they also facilitated the Zionist project. And they rarely talked about extraction and austerity as causes of Palestinian poverty, hunger, or death, even when they sometimes privately argued for more resources for Palestinians, like some officials. But still, they put it within a civilizational, rhetorical frame. So I just want to pull this to the present a little bit and put it in another context. That we know that hunger is rarely produced by unknown or natural factors. It's about social and political commitments and distributions. And making people hungry is a political strategy. We know this from a lot of examples. The British created the famine of Bengal in 1843. The US government killed buffalo in the plains around the same time in the mid-19th century to control natives in the so-called Nebraska territory. They were doing well, they were resisting, and they needed to control them. I recently taught J.T. Rohn's Dark Agoras, and there you get reminded about how control of calories and food was central to the control of enslaved Africans in the US, and how the plots and communities people built to deal with that, and how that continued to be a struggle post-slavery. And he kind of brings it up to the Philadelphia area. You can also look at Clinton's dumping of US rice on Haiti in the 90s, since he was a politician from rice-growing Arkansas, and the impact on native rices and native pigs as sources of nutrition and economic independence. You can also look at the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and IMF, and the encouragement of commodity production for the purposes of export, and of course, the import of cheapened and lower quality food from the West. And I was recently living happening in Jordan last year. And, I really see this, the costs of these policies. So for me, the longtime Zionist commitment to destroying Palestinian trees, stealing the land, restricting agricultural production, counting calories, and starving Palestinians is a sister of these strategies. No one is surprised by them. Yeah,
Thank
horrific as
you
they
for
are.
that. Yeah, appreciate that. So there's also an interesting commentary. I found it interesting on the restriction of gynecology to colonial men and regulation over the activities of Palestinian women, midwives in particular. It, just to be found, I just found this really interesting. I'd never really thought about this too much, and I know gynecology has this, like, as an area of medicine, it has this very kind of shady and fraught history, and patriarchy and racism are really heavily involved. There's a lot of work that's been done around that in the US context with gynecology and black women and so on, but primarily you don't focus your argument primarily on gynecology or on gynecologists here. You're mainly examining how they treat and regulate kind of Palestinian midwives and some of the legal architecture, as like well as like just the kind of restrictions on what they can and cannot do. And so, anyways, could you talk a little bit about those dynamics?
Yeah. So in Arabic, well, first I want to say that I have an article under review with a Palestinian midwife, and where we're looking at contemporary, conflicts between Palestinian nurse midwives and Palestinian gynecologists and the Palestinian National Authority, the Ministry of Health, things like that. But okay, so going back, to that period. So in Arabic, midwives are called dayat, and later they're called qabilat. And their main governors were British, although the vast majority operated outside of their purview for most of history and during the British Mandate, unless they were caught, since the British weren't particularly interested in Palestinian healthcare, although they were very interested that Palestinian births be registered. Yeah. So with gynecologists, it was there's a big feminist history on the development of gynecology as in different parts of the world. Unfortunately, it's mostly in the West, and I just want to look sometimes at it not from that perspective, because experts are all experts of all ethnicities. They actually get caught, they're trained in pretty international kinds of circles with international norms. And that was true in the early 20th century, and it's true now. But the British, so gynecologists have an economic interest in childbirth, and they want to control it because I think it's the main reason. Childbirth, pregnancy, children, that's like big business. Okay, it's the main reason people want to see a provider. And so yeah, like purely crass, there is that logic. And gynecology has its own history of sort of, kind of masculinizing and professionalizing the field in alliance with political systems. And that power is not to be underestimated in Palestine or elsewhere. But still, Palestinian doctors were lower. They were low. Lower than Jewish doctors or British officials. And but then they too could have a contested history with contested relations with traditionally trained healers and midwives, as well as nurse midwives. And there were a lot. Like Alice, who I mentioned, was I think she was trained at the American University in Beirut as a nurse. And she's, I think, from Haifa. I wish I could find more on Alice Boutros. So there's that. So I have a section in chapter 2 titled Governing Palestinian Midwives that's based on primary documents. And a lot of them made it to the archives because Palestinians sat outside with typewriters and got paid to translate, things from Arabic to English. So I thought I would read bits from that section if, just hold on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So healthcare austerity and a racialized pedagogical orientation to health went hand in hand with energetic regulation in Palestine. The Department of Health was full of technical supervisors, they called them. I read hundreds of communications between superintendents of midwifery, matrons, senior medical officers, they were usually Palestinian, and directors of the Department of Health with Palestinian midwives, nurses, physicians, and municipal officials about drains, doors, disinfectants, vacations, pay, milk, and food rations, and hours of work at clinics and infant welfare centers. Many of these scribbled or typed notes related to policing the boundaries of registered Palestinian midwives who dared to use specula to examine pregnant women, give injections to the ill, or independently set up shop. Licensing and regulating in health domains in Palestine were the responsibility of a matrix of offices that employed hundreds of military and civilian British men, most and women health professionals, bookkeepers, statisticians. They moved from London, Dublin, or Edinburgh, or more typically from colony to colony as opportunities arose. And what I argue there is it's naive to accept at face value claims that health-regulated regulations and requirements were primarily or even secondarily attached to improving the health of the colonized or the quality of care. So here I'm going to go to 105. So just to show the power, of healers, this is a very racist matron who was very powerful in the Jerusalem and Bethlehem areas. And she writes an article, a British matron. She writes a 1934 article published in a nursing journal where she illustrates the high social status of Palestinian women, expert at delivering babies, and negative colonial judgment toward them. She writes that the Daya was powerful in Palestine. Her word was law, and her, quote, equipment was of the simplest, often consisting merely of the famous chair on which the patient sat for her delivery. Some midwives carried a pair of shears, a ball of string for ligatures, and a basin of filthy oil for lubricating, unquote. Rogers described birthing rooms full of women and children honored to be invited, noting, quote, only 2 years ago, a woman complained of our cleanliness and quietness, saying she was not used to it, unquote. And then there was also a Finnish anthropologist who lived in Palestine, Grankvist, for a total of 3 years. And she studied birth, childhood, and death in a Bethlehem village of Artas. And she also describes great honor accorded to Palestinian midwives who had to be paid for their work. Otherwise, a person was, quote, indebted to them for all eternity, unquote. Invited women surrounded a woman in labor in her home, replacing each other as needed, although they could not be menstruating and must have bathed if they had had sex in order to protect the woman and baby from the many dangers perceived to abound from the spirit world. In cities, midwives brought with them a birth chair that had been forbidden since the English came into the country, she writes. British nurse midwives instead expected women in labor to lie down. Rogers' account and my interviews with elderly women, 26 elderly women who gave birth in the 1940s, indicate that many Palestinian dayat continued to use such a chair, and women used other methods. And I just want to read this little section from 113, which is the conclusion of that chapter. And I say that, that in the chapter we see multi-layered but porous surveillance of Palestinian midwives and healers, as well as a gendered and racialized colonial decision-making structure. Rogers, a never-married British nurse matron, was subordinate to higher-level colonial officials in Palestine, all men, who left to her and the limited number of Palestinian male physicians employed by the government the dirty business of field work with women and children. But she was high in relation to Palestinian midwives, whether licensed or unlicensed, because the colonial system required they recognize her as their teacher, surveyor, and gatekeeper. And I show that I talk about a few cases in this chapter, and I conclude that the triggering event in the Bahia case illustrates one of the issues that made Rogers and other British health officials apoplectic. She violated colonial, racial, and gendered boundaries of scientific knowing and health practice. Under no circumstances was she to represent herself as a nurse, quote unquote. Bahia admitted to giving injections with the permission of 2 Palestinian physicians and was accused of using a speculum and tampons on women, likely by competing midwives who recognized well the colonial red lines that would force a response. I just want to say there, the tampons, Palestinian women use tampons as prophylactics, from getting pregnant. And so back to the inside of women's bodies, however, was the territory, quote unquote, to use Takeshida's evocative phrasing with respect to the global development of the IUD, of male gynecologists who wanted to know better and control access to this inner terrain. Injections, specula, enemas, and examining hands were prized expert tools of bodily penetration allowed only to European and non-European men physicians, and to a lesser degree British nurses in Palestine. And I studied the training book, of nurses that the British used for Palestinians and for themselves, Palestinian nurses. David Arnold argues it is difficult to understate the centrality of the body as a site of colonizing power, despite colonial medicine's inability to erase multiple readings, quote unquote, of the somatic in indigenous epistemologies and cosmologies. The corollary is that Western medicine, quote, cannot be regarded as merely a matter of scientific interest, unquote, or, quote, abstracted from the broader character of the colonial order, unquote. Rather, it was, quote, intimately bound up with the nature and aspirations of the colonial state itself, unquote. It seeks monopolistic rights over the body through professionalization and exclusion of folk practitioners. And I mean, Palestinian obstetricians were also implicated in that. In light of these observations, the differences between licensed Alice or Bahia and unlicensed traditional midwives were likely not dramatic in the eyes of colonial officials who considered all of them inferior subjects, although Bahia was literate in Arabic and Alice was literate in Arabic and English. So that's how I'll end that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you've already talked about this a little bit, but you may add a couple of thoughts on. But one of the things that's often noted with regard to the state known as Israel these days is that is how religion is used as the basis of the of these different structures like apartheid kind of segmentations of the populations, or a certain basis on which forms of citizenship and non-citizenship, or sort of levels of citizenship. And you write about how this already had a kind of basis within the British colonial mandate period. So could you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to read, but less, from pages 125 and 126. So there were only 2 censuses, and there is scholarship on this, that were conducted during the entire mandate. There was the 1922 census, which was designed to enumerate, quote, Palestine residents by religious group as the basis for proportional, notably sect-based, voting for a projected legislative council. Yeah, they were still pretending that, unquote. And that never got established. And that's in Justin McCarthy's book. This hyperbolization of religious difference was common, as we know, a common European method of divisive governmentality in the colonies. And there were a lot of weaknesses in these censuses. The 1931 census of Palestine used similar methods, estimating quote unquote Bedouins, pastoralists, and undercounting younger women and Muslims who largely lived in rural areas. Yeah, and I talk a bit about how the Zionists dealt with these censuses, especially the 1931 census. They made sure they became involved in those censuses to serve their the second census to serve their interests. And so what I found interesting is just again, not surprising, but that the category of religion as a technology of colonial rule confounded Zionists with non-Zionist Jews, and Jewish white settlers with indigenous Jews and Jews who had migrated from Yemen and elsewhere over the decades. Such categorizations articulated quote unquote Jew as a separate national project in legal, material, and practical terms, and reinforced the divide and conquer logic on which the colonial and settler colonial projects were built. So combined with the apartheid structures built by Zionist institutions in Palestine during the Mandate, these technologies consolidated a Jewish, non-Jewish divide on which Zionism is premised. Yeah, so that I think is I'm trying to figure out, hold on one second. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the other issue I mentioned earlier, which is how, and I mentioned here too with Bedouins, which is that attempt that continues to this day and continued after Israel was established, that divided Palestinian communities along religious, religious categories. But that was set up by the British. And I have some footnotes on who, there was a category of other as well that the British used, and which I figured out consolidated Druze, Metawiles, which is Shia, Baha'is, Samaritans, which are indigenous Jewish people, Hindus, Sikhs, and no religion. They threw all that into a religious category. This is what they do, and they also do it with culture. So
Right.
yeah,
That's very interesting. So,
yeah.
we also touched on this a little bit earlier, but there's this weird paradox too, where infant mortality is a statistic that the colonial state is supposed to keep track of, and that's interesting in its own way, like the way that through these mandates and through the colonial period at the time, they're like, have to keep track of certain health statistics, and that becomes a rationale, right? For, as you were saying earlier, like sometimes they're asking for more money, right, for certain things and using, statistics for this. But, keeping the statistic obviously should have been a rationale to provide better healthcare. And, that there were, even amid that, there were these arguments that, we don't want to lower, at least as I understood it in your book, they don't want to lower the infant mortality rate too much because that would lead to greater population growth. So there was always this demographic concern. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first, I want to say that, it was a mandate to the League of Nations. So there are a lot of statistical reports that they had to report, they had to report. So, so statistics was definitely an obsession, but not one they really invested in, and and because it takes money to actually do that, and that wasn't that important. So I, studied their statistical reports on health and so on, partly to figure out, like, well, even though I knew they were very, very flawed, right? Because a lot of people were villagers, most people were villagers, and there were certain rules, like you had to report to the town. A doctor had to say, like, what was the cause of death, for example. So when I related to the previous question, when there were differentials in infant mortality based on religion in the British Health and Vital reports, which there were dramatic ones I show, they were sometimes explained by cultural arguments and other times understood to be caused by poverty and lack of health care. But there was, in my research, I found one explicit prose discussing the demographic balance produced by high birth. This is on page 126, 127, discussing the balance between high birth and high infant mortality among Palestinian Muslims, and then connecting mortality levels to healthcare access, which was in the Department of Health annual report for 1931. And again, it wasn't signed. It wasn't signed, I couldn't, but I guess from other contextual knowledge that it was either George Heron or J.W.P. Harkness. And one of them commented on the high incidence of Muslim infant mortality in comparison to Jewish infant mortality, attributing the difference to, quote, the adequate chain of Jewish infant welfare centers, unquote, and hospital confinements for Jewish women giving birth in comparison to the limited number of such institutions and hospital care for Palestinian infants and mothers. The author then mentioned the differential in, quote, natural increase of population, unquote, between Jews and Muslims that year, describing the figure for Palestinians as, quote, alarming in light of the apparent impossibility of providing outlet for the population, which is already in a state of financial depression and will soon be unable to feed itself. The high Muslim figure, right, this is birth, suggests that the fellahin are not yet feeling the pinch of hunger, but when this occurs, the death rate is likely to go up and the birth rate down, unquote. And there are other parts of the book where I actually show how important that is actually to family size for Palestinians. That wasn't the purpose of that article, but I used it that way. So Beth Barron also she has a chapter focused on infant child mortality in British colonial Egypt, and she found similar, quote, ambivalence among colonial officials about lowering the high infant mortality rate, quote, 20 years earlier because they were, quote, fearful of fueling population growth, unquote. The author of the 1910, the British author, Department of Public Health annual report explained that government efforts to address infant mortality, quote, should be directed to avoiding any serious disturbance of the balance between the birth rate and the death rate, unquote. Colonial public health investments in Egypt were mainly concerned to mitigate diseases that damage the health of military forces and their families. This is like in Palestine. British colonial officials in early 20th century Uganda and interwar Nigeria this is what I found from other scholarship, expressed concern in contrast about low birth and high infant mortality rates resulting from conquest and new labor management systems because they threatened colonial labor needs. Infant mortality rates remained high in British African colonies through the 1940s. Yeah, so there was always math going on, racial math going on in their heads.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about it, but you do talk in the book too about how, like, concerned they are, kind of as you referenced that thing about soldiers, like they were concerned about the British police or whatever they were, the colonial, kind of occupying army there. Their health statistics were very important to them,
Yes,
um, you
yes.
know.
But then
Um,
there was also just, I mean, British eugenics is also for the Brits, it's also very classed. I mean, I don't want to erase that. So they definitely had this thing of you have to have the economic means, to have your children. So they were ambivalent, like about how much to cover for the wives of cops, that they brought in to Palestine. So, but yeah, exactly. But mostly it's about the economic imperial project success.
Yeah. So I want to talk more about eugenics.
Yeah.
um, because this is really, I found that to be really interesting within this text. And correct my pronunciation if I mess this up, but you quote Abu El-Hajj, who writes
Yeah.
that activists, quote, aim to cultivate a new Hebrew who would be radically different biologically and not just culturally from the diaspora Jews. And so this is really interesting. Quote goes on to say, and they took the biological piece of that regeneration seriously. The Jewish body had to be rejuvenated. Jewish degeneration had to be countered, even as who it was who qualified as the most degenerate Jew would shift over time, end quote. And I have to just say there to the censors that I'm quoting scholarship there and that's not my own term. But um, can you just talk about this aspect of the Zionist settler colonial project, and say a little bit about the origins, this eugenic viewpoint that you're looking at, and kind of how it was put into practice?
Yeah. So I have a whole chapter on that. It's titled Children Are the Treasure and the Property of the Nation, Demography, Eugenics, and Mothercraft. And what I do in that chapter is examine British and Zionist demographic anxieties and their eugenicist inflections in Mandate Palestine, which came from different places and had global precursors and diffractions. British authorities frequently expressed concern with higher Palestinian birth rates, which they racialized from early in the occupation, as we discussed. These concerns were balanced by rarely expressed calculus we discussed that recognized limited investment in Palestinian welfare and infant, child, and maternal health care produced higher infant mortality rates. But the chapter also explores Jewish and British eugenicist discourse that predates and overlaps with the Mandate period and its iterations among Zionist health workers as they built a Jewish settler colonial homeland in Palestine. Children are the treasure and property of the nation was one of the maxims used in the Hadassah-sponsored Health Week, quote unquote, which targeted indigenous, long-standing resident and settler Jews in Palestine. Keep in mind that Hadassah was established by U.S. Jewish women from the Northeast who had been involved in progressive era health projects in places like Philly and New York. In fact, I show close coordination between Zionists in cities like Boston, Cambridge, people working in public health and university positions, for example, and the building, funding, and promotion of Zionist universities, labs, and medical systems. So that's one genealogy, strongly grounded in eugenicist and epigeneticist sensibilities centered on population health and reproduction. So going to Nadia Abul-Hajj's book, as well as Mitchell Hart's book, which is titled The Healthy Jew, The Symbiosis of Judaism and Modern Medicine, another thread is a strong, I would call, inter-European family battle, also related to eugenics, about weak and strong populations and Jewish elite commitments to show that Jews were a racial and biological category. Like they had an interest in producing that, Zionists especially, that in eugenic terms were not inferior to other Europeans as pushed by anti-Jewish racist tropes, but but more, they were actually more advanced, the argument was, than non-Jews in terms of their hygiene and quality of their children. And some of this is Nadia Abul-Hajj, Mitchell Hart, these scholars, it goes back, they make arguments that go back to Moses. So there was, before I did this book, I knew there was a strong gendered and sexual components to the racial arguments, as there were in eugenicist campaigns and in a lot of the Zionist literature from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Like the leaders, these elite leaders were like, about Palestine is their ground. It's fantasia. They would ride horses. They would become, they wouldn't be inferior, city people or ghetto residents. Men would become men. It was also, a lot of I look in one chapter at sexology and the sexologists, in Palestine, and the Zionist ones. And, they were anti-disability. They were anti-queer. They were, in other work that I dealt with, like in the Palestine seminar, in the discussion with Louis Alday, they were anti-elderly people. I mean, there was, the project is strongly eugenicist, even though neither Hart nor Al-Hajj, they kind of go before, you know what I mean? They're not necessarily talking about the British mandate period, but I felt like I had to go do that in order to, understand how eugenicist was the eugenicism I was seeing, and the epigenetics that they were invested in. Because in the literature, there is like so-called positive and negative eugenics, and the Holocaust produces this kind of like, okay, we can't talk about that anymore. But it is not, I mean, I don't even have to make this argument, but I will. That stuff basically goes under other names in post-World War II, in the Population Council, in the World Health Organization, in the UN organizations, and the way in which they target, and they still target, and now foundations, private projects around health, the way they target healthcare, health systems, and women, in the so-called third world. So anyway, I mean, in Palestine, I show how this kind of panned out, in how much demographic racial competition with Palestinians was central in the discourses, policies, and systems. And even though I don't have Hebrew, I have enough, I got enough evidence, and other scholars have also shown it to be really crucial to the Zionist project during the mandate period. And it just was on steroids afterwards.
I think that's a really important point too, because I think it's, there could be one way to read that where you're like, okay, this is a response to like the Holocaust and like this, but like to be able to trace it back to the mandate period and all of that, you can say like, no, this stuff was already all here, right? And yes, it could be exacerbated, right, by that sort of being subjected to that negative eugenics project of Nazism, right? But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, even in ways that you kind of hear it play out. There's always this. I hear this a lot. I'm sure you've come across it, right? Of any criticism of Israel now, right, or the way that, for instance, Israel has responded. With this genocidal campaign since October 7th, you hear people say, oh, well, you don't want a strong Jewish people, a strong Jewish state that's able to defend itself and to win wars, right? And things like this. And it's just interesting, that language. Like, I can't think of a corollary, right, to other instances of, maybe if you go far enough back, but like, usually when you critique countries around war, there's people who disagree with you and say, no, we need to do it, et cetera, et cetera. This is why. But to put that argument specifically around that basically you're presenting a kind of anti-Semitic argument that has to do with this idea of a strong race of people kind of thing. It's
Yeah.
very weird,
And
and
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, go on.
Oh, I was
You
just gonna say,
finish your thought.
well, I was just gonna say Nadir dropped this comment in that eugenics shifted today to family planning programs courtesy of U.S. aid to third world countries, which was uh, they made this comment earlier, but it connects to what you were just saying too about the kind of nonprofits and stuff. But go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, so on that, I mean, you also have the Gates Foundation and you've got the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's where the governmentality idea is interesting because it's like you got like the social workers, the governments, the USAID, and the foundations kind of working together. I forgot what I was gonna say about.
Well,
But what were
I
you
had
saying? I was
I was
responding.
talking about that notion that criticism
Oh,
of
yes, of
Israel
the strong.
militarism. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's strong. I mean, again, you don't want to say, "Oh, this isn't a concern among, you know, non non-Jews or something." But even today, there's scholarship, a kind of rising disability, scholarship in the entity, about the entity, and there is just a really strong eugenicist thing about that tracks with abortions as well. So I mean, you get into just really interesting places in a society, scary places in a society that where this is there, you know. This eugenicist sensibility is there. And then it puts in a different light the deliberate starvation, what Jasper Puar calls maiming, you know, of Palestinians. The slowing down, and honestly, just what we're seeing, straight out like murder of pregnant women and children and everything. That kind of destruction is yeah. You come to your own
Yeah.
conclusions. Yeah.
I mean, I think, Abdul Jawad has said on here, and I really appreciate the kind of way that he talks about this, is that he sees a desire to produce the lack of civilization and civilizational coherence among Palestinians to be able to. So when they say, we're fighting human animals, right? Like he sees a desire to actually make that a reality by constantly attacking all the forms of like social and civic life.
Right.
And so yeah, it's interesting in terms of this way of, like you say, like sort of producing disability, maiming, and attacking these sites of healthcare, right, and reproduction. I mean, it's interesting that way, not interesting in a good way. I mean, obviously,
Right.
it's really heinous, but
Yes.
yeah. So the remaining chapters, you really look intently on what you call Palestinian anti-reproductive desires, or basically the ability of Palestinian women to access birth control and abortions and kind of cultural norms around this. You do some great work interviewing, elders and stuff like that, and kind of the own experiences of Palestinians with this. Again, to get past what you talked about earlier about like there's not information really in the archive about this because these things were, criminalized. There's not information in memoirs typically because either men write them, or if women do, they're not talking about the most internal aspects of their lives. And um, there's also this discussion, this interest, right? Because we've already talked about kind of the demographic concerns of Zionism and of colonialism here. But there's a question, right, that you're looking at of, how do Palestinians respond to this? Do they respond to this? Do they, have their own demographic concern about kind of a race? This is a question, right, of like, uh, for Israel, they're very concerned with trying to increase the number of Jewish people within historic Palestine, occupied Palestine, in order to have a kind of uh, not a they don't have a majority, but right, trying to kind of being constantly concerned with these demographics. And how do Palestinians then respond to that? It seems like is one of the questions. Um, so I mean, I'll let you speak on it, but I don't think you really find any significant evidence that Palestinians are um, really obsessed with this kind of demographic race. But what were some of the things that you learned through this examination?
Yeah. Uh, so one thing I take on is the demographic literature, because demographic arguments get used a lot, in like even, and I take on some good demographers, like, because I actually don't like to take on kind of shitty work. I mean, why waste time? Um, I hate that. Uh, so, so in this the final body chapter is chapter 6, and it's called The Art of Death in Life: Palestinian Futurism and Reproduction After 1948. And it's sort of divided into two parts. Like, really, maybe they should have been two chapters, but I feel like they needed to go together. So one is just like this demographic literature, what is going on that we know demographically in like Palestine. And I also show how how poorly designed a lot of scholarship is, and how it makes, because I am also a social scientist, and I've trained in research methods. I teach research methods, and I've taught research methods, and and sometimes I just find it really fascinating how conclusions come out of a design, that shouldn't, they don't make any sense. How the conclusions are often framed by ideological discourse or interest, or what's dominant in the demographic scholarship. And often that scholarship is a lot like interested in women, interested in women's rights, interested in women's access, which I am. I'm interested in reproductive justice, and that includes the ability to have a child and to sustain a child, but also not to. And I show that Palestinian women are like every other category, and men too, by the way, but they have different desires, and that was true during the mandate, after the mandate, in the present. And you'd have to do something a lot more fine-grained than what we usually get, which I think is just very racialized, and just layered with all these problems. So in this chapter, in the first half, I propose, maybe in the whole. The first is demographic. And then the second, I actually look at Palestinian cultural production, Palestinian poetry, Palestinian literature, Palestinian iconography, after 1948, because I can't quite find, exactly how am I going to come to conclusions, plus the interviews, plus my own friendships and relationships with many, many, many Palestinian and Arab women of multiple generations, all the differences that if you weren't a racist, you would understand exist in any society. So what I do in this chapter is I propose that demographic competition with Jews has been largely irrelevant to Palestinian reproductive desires and practices since 48, a year during which they viscerally and universally recognize the importance to Zionism of the double action of quote-unquote Judaizing and quote-unquote de-Arabizing the land. I show how the operations of Zionist demographic biopower and Palestinian resistance within Israel shift, exist as pluralities, and actually I would say within historic Palestine, shift, exist as pluralities in the same time and place, and are never totalizing. Representing Palestinians as hyperbolically reproductive as a resistance strategy has had at least three consequences, I argue. First, it projects and magnifies onto Palestinians what are, in fact, Zionist and Western pathologies and anxieties that are highly well documented, reflected in the policies and priorities of their governments, knowledge industries, and foundations, motivated by geopolitical, ideological, and material interests. Second, it misses the range of socioeconomic, psychic, and contextual factors that have shaped Palestinian reproductive and anti-reproductive desires and practices. Third, it distorts our ability to see the emphasis on creative, political, and social struggle and regeneration in the face of social and political death in the futurities articulated after 1948. Indeed, I found death to be more relevant than reproduction in my analysis of Palestinian poetry, fiction, and film. You know, the kind of killing that is produced by the settler colonialism and how you survive through it. But I also found, and I mean, this is subtle, but you have to get this part, which is intergenerational family and community survival through political, creative, and military struggle to be the most powerful futurity at play since 1948. And Palestinian iconography, literature, art, Palestinian life shows this really well. That how, you know, you balance the ever-present Zionist and colonial project of trying to extinguish Palestinian futurity with Palestinian survival and refusal. And so, yeah, that's basically, and I really go into that a lot, including just looking at queer futurities as well. And, you know, that's kind of how I do a little bit with Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism. But I also look at queer, you know, debates around reproduction and futurity. And then I think about that in relation to queerness as also part of Palestine. Yeah. So, and what that, and yeah, and I look at a lot of famous, I mean, let's just say a few iconic, famous texts, Darwish, Emil Habibi, and various other,
Yeah,
artists.
I love that chapter. I mean, I thought
Okay,
it was
thank
cool,
you.
and I liked the one, like, including those, like, the poems and things like that, but also the analysis of them and, like, different ways to analyze them too, because, like, one of the ones you used from Darwish, you know, is sort of this. I can't remember exactly, you could probably remind me, but it's like, you know, I have 8 children, I'm gonna have 9 or something like that, and, there's a way to read it, right, that could be, like, very pro-reproductive as a way of, as producing fear, right, in Zionism and so on, um,
Right.
but there's other ways to read it too, and I appreciate you kind of, like, laying some of that out.
And Darwish's own, like, I don't know,
Right.
he wrote this when he was maybe 21, and you know, he argued that like, what is it about imprisoning us in our, like, you know, like, he has this. So I actually do that, and then I also analyze a poem called the Dice Player, I think,
Mhm.
that was close, that he produced close to the end of his life. Everyone should read that chapter. Yeah, don't
Yeah,
get
sure.
tired by chapter 6. But also, I have the coda is sort of really, I mean, sad. I mean, I find it sad and important, and sad in light of what's happening now, which is called life, death, and regeneration. And there, I kind of, use posters and use Martez Dejani's, some of his like artwork around massacres and genocides in Lebanon. Like how do Palestinians sort of respond? And I think it's notable that Dejani, helped establish a very important, I think, Jannah, like, for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. How do you survive, intergenerationally when you're so far, when you don't have direct memory and direct experience of historic Palestine? How do you maintain, optimism and knowledge? And those are the futurities that are also absolutely crucial to Palestinians and Palestinian life and survival, and they will continue. Guarantee that. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, you also talked briefly too. I didn't form a question around this, but of course, with obviously the killing of martyr Walid Daka, there's been some discussion also about how, like, this he smuggled out, or his partner smuggled out sperm, right? And he had a child, right? And you talk about that practice, um, which was, is much more widespread than just that instance, as a refusal, and also, response to the way, like, incarceration is used as this, um, way of breaking up families, or and so that was
Right.
an interesting section too. Yeah.
Yeah, so I forgot that I analyzed film. So in that chapter too, so like Wedding in Galilee and some more recent short films. And I do a double thing there with sperm smuggling. So first, I mean, and I wasn't talking about Walid or, you know, and so, but I was just, thinking about what we want to do with, a kind of gender dynamic in which, yes, having children is, women gain status from having children, and especially from having boy children, and that's not limited to Palestinians. And so and there are like economic reasons for that, cultural reasons. I go through them, but yeah. So I think that there's both. I both look at sperm smuggling and then also temper, a kind of just a complete like liberationist argument,
Sure.
to that, which just reminds us of always there are internal contradictions, as I keep saying, so people are always balancing a variety of things, but also desire. And our desires don't come from nowhere, but they're not fully conscious, I mean. And so yeah, and I do think children are beautiful. So yeah, so I kind of play with that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. Yeah. And I think, like, this, you talked a little bit about some of the reasons, right? And, like, yeah, there's this, I think, as you say, like, death is the kind of, um, it's so ever present, right? And that there is this dedication to life, and also to, on some level, you talk about too, of, like, just thinking about also soldiers, right? Thinking about producing folks who can fight in a liberation struggle in various ways,
Mhm.
not just as soldiers, right? But as, continuing to resist, right? As part of the impulse, rather than, like, that. It's a way of not thinking about it, or kind of displacing this idea that it's just sort of a demographic race, right? But also, like, no, this is it's a way of continuing to produce life, right? And that aspect of it as well. So anyway, I really appreciate the book. I encourage people to check it out. You can, like we said at the beginning, you can get it open access. So feel free to, dip into it and see what you think, and hopefully read the whole thing. And yeah, Francis, it's always good to be in conversation with you. I appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us about this work.
Yes, thank you, Jay, for having me.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you wanted to say or share with folks before we let you go?
Not really. I mean,
Okay. Right on.
thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. We'll be back with a few streams next week. So have a good weekend.